Hello, I'm Bakhtiar Sonova and you're watching A News. So let's take a look at today's top stories. Donald Trump backs off from European tariffs threat in a bid to get Greenland. The US President Donald Trump launched the Board of Peace at a signing ceremony in Davos. And Israel's attack on Gaza kills 11 Palestinians, including 3 journalists. Russian President Vladimir Putin is due to meet U.S. envoys Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner in Moscow later today, as efforts to end the war in Ukraine continue. The Kremlin said it appreciates Witkoff's diplomatic efforts but declined to comment on his optimism that a deal is close, adding it would brief reporters after the talks. Witkoff said a lot of progress has been made with negotiations narrowed down to one unresolved issue, though he did not give details. Meanwhile, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky is in Switzerland, where he met U.S. President Donald Trump and discussed the proposed peace plan. Trump said that his meeting with Zelensky was very good. Earlier, Trump said Zelensky and Putin were at a point where an agreement to end the war was possible.
President Putin, that's not good.
Ukraine's capital Kiev is facing the harshest winter of the war. Heavy snowfall and freezing temperatures have made life on the streets dangerous. Russian strikes on energy facilities have made the situation even worse. Now residents try to find ways to survive.
Cold weather, lack of heating, and no electricity. This is what has pushed people in Ukraine's Kiev region to seek warmth. In the town of Brovary, old railway cars now turned into temporary shelters from the cold. Families, elderly residents, and relatives of Ukrainian soldiers use the decommissioned carriages as winter tightens its grip. The trains provide heat, electricity, and a brief escape from apartments left without power after recent attacks. Some say temperatures at home have dropped to 5 degrees Celsius. Inside the trains, people charge devices and have hot lunches, while children from an acting class hold lessons there because their usual premises are too cold.
If someone had told me that this would happen in Ukraine, I would never have believed them. No one wants this war. We want peace and goodness.
With temperatures falling as low as -20 Celsius in Kiev, Ukraine is facing one of the coldest winters in years. Russia's missile and drone strikes on Ukraine's energy infrastructure in recent months have made the situation worse. As Russia continues its strikes, Ukrainian maintenance crews are working to restore a power plant.
We are restoring damaged infrastructure to provide people with electricity and heat, because not only electricity depends on this infrastructure, but also people's heating. The weather conditions are against us now. It is very cold, but we are not stopping. We are working to restore as much equipment as possible after the attacks as soon as possible.
Now 4,000 buildings in Kiev remain without heating, and nearly 60% of the city is without power following days of Russian attacks on Ukraine's power grid.
U.S. President Donald Trump has backed off from his tariff threats on European allies after exploring a potential deal on Greenland after talks with NATO. On social media, Trump offered little detail on what was discussed, but described it as very productive. Our correspondent has more on the story.
Welcome to This Day in Europe, with major twists and turns over Greenland. U.S. President Trump, after meeting with NATO Chief Mark Rutte, dropped his tariff threat against the EU and said he created the framework for a future deal that, quote, if consummated, will be great for the U.S. and all NATO nations. It will be handled by U.S. Vice President J.D. Vance, Secretary of State Marco Rubio, and Special Envoy Steve Witkoff. This development comes on the heels of the extraordinary summit in Brussels today, called by European Council President Antonio Costa after Trump's previous threats of tariffs. Costa decided to convene the meeting of the European Council after consultations with member states. According to Costa's statement, several topics were to be discussed: the importance of international law, unity in supporting Denmark and Greenland, and recognizing the shared transatlantic interest in peace and security. It will be interesting to find out how they position themselves now, given Trump's remarks last night. Earlier on Wednesday, in Trump's address at the World Economic Forum in Davos, he said he wanted to enter immediate negotiations to take control of the Arctic territory, calling it part of North America and vital to U.S. security. But he also said, quote, "I don't want to use force. I won't use force." However, he asserted that no nation or group of nations is in any position to secure Greenland other than the U.S., and he challenged Denmark's claim to the autonomous territory. At stake in today's emergency summit is more than just a diplomatic response to Trump's dramatic Greenland gambit. It's a test of Europe's ability to defend its values, unity, and strategic autonomy. After Trump's claims of a framework deal with NATO and the suspension of planned tariffs on EU nations, Brussels must decide how far it's willing to push back against coercive pressure from a key ally without fracturing the transatlantic relationship. The outcome will shape not only EU-US ties and Arctic security policy, but also set a precedent for how Europe responds when its sovereignty and territorial integrity are challenged in an increasingly contested global order. For A News, I'm Anita Sharma in Arnhem, Netherlands.
Supporters of the YPG SDG staged a protest in Brussels on Wednesday, gathering near the European Parliament and waving group-linked flags while chanting slogans. Police intervened after unrest broke out using tear gas and water cannons to break up the crowd. The demonstrators later moved to Schuman Square near key EU buildings, where security was tightened with helicopters, riot control units, and a heavy police presence. The protest took place amid renewed tensions in northeastern Syria. Clashes have erupted between the Syrian army and the SDF, which is led by the YPG, the Syrian branch of the PKK, designated as a terrorist organization by the EU. Spain's second fatal train crash in Ademuz has shaken the country after the accident killed 43 people. Its transport minister says preliminary investigations show the deadly train crash was not caused by human error, and added that the track had been inspected 4 times in the last 3 months. Authorities are also examining a key piece of machinery found near the site, which may explain how the collision occurred.
I do believe that it is clear that the human factor here, at least as far as the driving of the 2 trains is concerned, had no bearing. The Irio train was travelling at a speed well below the maximum permitted on that section, which was 250 kilometres per hour, and the other one was travelling at around 200. According to the data we have at the moment, it may even have been slightly below the speed at the time of the accident.
U.S. President Donald Trump has launched his new Board of Peace at the World Economic Forum in Davos. The initiative brings together leaders from around the world to focus on Gaza and other global conflicts.
US President Donald Trump officially launched his Board of Peace on Thursday during a ceremony at the World Economic Forum in Davos. Leaders from 19 countries joined Trump on stage to sign the board's charter, including Azerbaijani President Ilham Aliyev, Argentina's Javier Milei, Hungary's Viktor Orban, Armenian Prime Minister Nikol Pashinyan, and Pakistan's Shehbaz Sharif. Trump called the board's members stars and described the initiative as a board of action.
It's going to be a great plan, and that's where the Board of Peace really started. And I think we can spread out to other things as we succeed with Gaza. We're going to be very successful in Gaza. It's going to be a great thing to watch, and we can do other things. We can do numerous other things. Once this board is completely formed, we can do pretty much whatever we want to do, and we'll do it in conjunction with the United Nations. You know, I've always said the United Nations has got tremendous potential, has not used it.
US Secretary of State Marco Rubio praised the initiative as a group of leaders that is about action, emphasizing its focus on delivering results rather than issuing statements. The board was initially conceived as part of Trump's 20-point Gaza ceasefire plan, aimed at demilitarizing and rebuilding the region, but the charter leaves room for a broader geopolitical role. About 35 nations have committed to joining the board, with invitations extended to roughly 60 others. Several European allies declined to participate, including Norway, Sweden and France, citing concerns the board could undermine the UN. The UK opted out over Russia's inclusion, and Canada, Ukraine and China had yet to confirm. Countries seeking permanent membership must contribute $1 billion, with Trump designated as permanent chairman, while non-paying members receive a 3-year term.
Russian President Vladimir Putin told Palestinian leader Mahmoud Abbas on Thursday that Russia is ready to send $1 billion in Russian assets frozen in the United States to President Donald Trump's Board of Peace initiative to support the Palestinian people. Putin added that the idea of using frozen Russian assets for the Board of Peace had previously been discussed with the United States.
We are ready to send $1 billion from the funds frozen in the United States under the previous administration to this new structure, the Board of Peace, first and foremost in order to support the Palestinian people and use these funds for reconstruction of Gaza and solution of Palestine's problems. I think this is quite possible. We used to discuss such options earlier with members of the American administration, and today we plan to discuss this issue at a meeting in Moscow.
Over to Gaza, where 11 Palestinians have been killed, including 2 children and 3 journalists, according to local medics. Palestinian health officials said the reporters were killed while traveling in a car on an assignment sponsored by Egypt. The Israeli military said it had eliminated a Palestinian militant who posed a threat to soldiers. It is the latest violence disrupting a fragile 3-month ceasefire, with both sides blaming each other. Staying on Gaza, the humanitarian situation continues to deteriorate. The United Nations says damage to key infrastructure and access restrictions have disrupted around 70% of Gaza City's water supply. As winter conditions persist, thousands of displaced civilians are facing severe shortages of water and heating.
Our partners working on water, sanitation, and hygiene warned that approximately 70% of Gaza City's total water production is currently disrupted due to challenges related to repairing the Mekorot water supply line. The line comes from Israel into Gaza and is located east of the so-called Yellow Line, where Israeli forces remain deployed. An assessment of the pipeline identified the need for a section of steel pipe that is not available in Gaza and is restricted from entry into Gaza as a dual-use item. A request that one of our partners made to repair the Safa well, another important water source for Gaza City, was denied by the Israeli authorities on Sunday. As Gaza remains in the grip of winter, another hypothermia-related child death was reported by the Gaza Ministry of Health yesterday. This brings the total number of reported deaths linked to cold weather this season to 9. Once again, the Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs calls for urgent solutions, including allowing the entry of batteries, solar panels, and other energy sources that are needed to set up communal heating spaces.
2 oil tankers that were seized this month by the United States in its campaign against Venezuela were spotted near Puerto Rico on Wednesday. That's according to tankertrackers.com data. One of the vessels, supertanker M. Sofia, was seized on the 7th of January carrying Venezuelan oil. The smaller one, Galileo, was taken last week empty, but had previously carried Venezuelan oil. U.S. officials have not disclosed the destinations or plans for them. The other 5 captured tankers are near the U.S. Gulf Coast in Venezuelan waters and near Scotland, according to shipping data. Turning to the UK, and a move that could see under 16-year-olds banned from using social media could be on its way to teens across the country, following in Australia's footsteps. The UK House of Lords has voted in favour to support a ban through, though, an amendment to the government's school bill. Under the revisions, the government would get a year to decide what platforms should be banned. But the Labour government has indicated it will try to overturn the amendment and hold its own consultation. However, some Labour MPs are in favour of the ban. Britain has approved a £453 million contract to modernize radar systems on its Typhoon fighter jet fleet, strengthening the backbone of its air defense. The upgrade comes amid rising security threats and forms part of a wider push to enhance military capability and long-term defense investment. Our correspondent Zeynep Farizadeh reports from Manchester.
The UK government has announced a major boost to its air defences, awarding a £453 million contract to upgrade radar systems on Typhoon fighter jets. The deal, worth about $608 million, have been handed to defence contractors including BAE Systems and Leonardo. Defence Secretary John Healey said the upgrade comes as security threats continue to grow, pointing to Russian drone attacks on Ukraine and incidents involving NATO airspace. He said the new radar capability would keep Britain secure at home and strengthen its position abroad. The Typhoon is the backbone of the UK's air defence fleet, and the country's upgrades to the fleet are important not just to protect the UK but to encourage other countries to order the jets, helping sustain production lines and jobs at home. The government also says the investment is about more than security. It is designed to support the UK economy. Ministers argue that modernising the Typhoon fleet will make the aircraft more attractive to overseas buyers, helping to sustain production lines and protect skilled jobs. Officials say the contract will secure more than 1,500 jobs across Britain. In October, the UK secured an £8 billion deal to sell Typhoon jets to Turkey, and officials believe further sales to Qatar and Saudi Arabia could follow. The government has also pledged to increase defence spending to 2.6% of GDP from 2027, signalling a long-term commitment to military investment. Zeynep Farizadeh, in News, Manchester, United Kingdom.
Turning to New Zealand's North Island, where several people are missing, including a child, after a landslide hit a campsite at Mount Maunganui on Thursday morning. It's after heavy rain caused widespread damage and left thousands without power.
Rescue teams in New Zealand's North Island are searching for several missing people, including children, after torrential rain triggered a landslide at a popular campsite.
Sounds good.
It happened at Mount Maunganui at around 9:30 in the morning, local time on Wednesday. Tons of mud and debris smothered tents, camper vans and nearby structures at the coastal tourist spot. Hundreds of people were evacuated to safety, while roads were shut across large parts of the island's eastern coast.
This huge tree crack and all this dirt come off like behind me, and then I look behind me and there's this huge landslide coming down, and I'm still shaking from it now. And and then I turn around and I had to jump out from my seat as fast as I could and just run, and then I dived across the other pool and looking behind me, and there was a caravan coming like right behind me. It was like the scariest thing I've ever experienced in my life.
Authorities say helicopters have been deployed to assist with the search, as thousands remain without electricity following widespread flooding and storm damage.
We're still in response mode, and that includes the tragedy that has unfolded behind us in the last few hours.
Emergency officials confirmed that signs of life were detected in the rubble, but rescue crews were forced to temporarily pull back over fears of further ground movement.
Look, again, I can't be drawn on numbers because it is possible we could find someone alive, so I can't be drawn on numbers other than say it's single figures.
New Zealand forecaster Met Service has lifted all weather warnings in the North Island as the tropical low moves east. Some warnings remain in place for the South Island, but they are expected to ease on Thursday.
Now we'll take a short break. Right after the break, we'll discuss President Donald Trump's new Board of Peace initiative and its implications for global diplomacy. Stay tuned. Welcome back to A News. President Donald Trump has formally launched his new international initiative, the Board of Peace, with a high-profile signing ceremony on the sidelines of the World Economic Forum in Davos. The body, originally tied to his 20-point Gaza ceasefire and reconstruction plan, endorsed by the United Nations, has been transformed into a broader, potentially global conflict resolution forum, with dozens of nations invited and roughly 35 committing so far. Trump has suggested this board could eventually work alongside traditional institutions like the United Nations, a prospect that has drawn both support and strong criticism from key allies around the world. Now we'll explore what this means for global diplomacy. I'm joined now by Daniela Mello, political scientist from Boston, United States. Daniela, welcome to the program and thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Daniela, what exactly is the Board of Peace and what was its original purpose?
Well, the Board of Peace is an initiative that came into fruition in last November, if memory doesn't fail, when the United Nations Security Council endorsed a plan to create this Board of Peace to oversee the Israel-Hamas ceasefire. So in that sense, it was going to be apparently an ad hoc almost sort of initiative that would deal quite specifically with the plan to stabilize, establish governance, and rebuild Gaza. What was presented to the world this week, however, is quite different in scope. As we see, the Board of Peace has now evolved into its own new international organization, it seems. Still, I mean, the president kept a lot of, the president and his founding executive board have kept a lot of the same ideas that this new group, this new Board of Peace would provide stability to a changing international order, that it would deal with issues of peace and war and governance. It sounds quite a lot like the job that the United Nations does do. So this has raised, and rightfully so, a lot of eyebrows and a lot of questions. I mean, more questions than answers have been provided thus far about what would the scope be and what sort of legitimacy would this international organization operate under. There is a passing allusion to adhering to international law and to work under the auspices of international law, but that remains sort of unclear what that means in practice and how this would be structured, legitimized, what would participation involved, would treaties be involved? We don't know the answers to those yet.
Why has Trump suggested the board might work with or even replace the United Nations?
Well, we know that the president is not a big fan of the United Nations, and in fact, in recent weeks, has announced the U.S. would be removing itself from 66 of its agencies and organizations that work under the auspices of the United Nations. The president sees the United Nations as inefficient and mostly as a roadblock to the interests of the United States rather than the other way around. And I mean, a lot of the criticisms that the president points at the United Nations are criticisms that are widely accepted. It's not the most democratic of bodies, though it does have a governance system. It does have a Security Council that has far more power than any others.
Yes.
What I will say is that the executive board and the position of chairman for life for Donald Trump at this new board doesn't seem to solve those problems. In fact, it seems to replicate some of them.
Daniela, which major countries have accepted invitations and which have declined? And what does this tell us?
A lot of the countries that have already accepted are countries that are led by autocratic leaders or by illiberal democracies, and that has raised some eyebrows amongst allies as well. So countries like Argentina and Hungary and Belarus and the UAE, Argentina immediately accepted being at the founding signing of the board. The European allies were conspicuously absent, and they have, in fact, raised many of the same issues. Are we trying to replace the United Nations? If we're going to replace it, what's the end goal? What sort of new structure are we replacing, and why replacing instead of working within the articles within the UN Charter that allow for the UN to be reassessed, right? I mean, there's actual mechanisms within the UN Charter that would allow for even the Security Council to be redefined and redrawn for a new international order. Donald Trump does not believe in the liberal international order, of which the United Nations is, in fact, perhaps the strongest symbol. He has no qualms talking about creating a new international order, and a new international order that would have the United States at the helm, and that would be shaped by his own vision for global economics, global security, global peace. So EU partners are very concerned about this. It's obviously another big signal of the fracture, the rupture in the transatlantic relationship, that European allies don't seem even willing to pay lip service to this. We have France, Germany, Italy immediately saying they would not be joining this board. So it's right now, it feels like a fan club of the president in terms of who got to sign in and who didn't.
So what are the geopolitical implications if countries like Russia or China decide to participate?
If countries like Russia and China decide to participate, it seems unclear how the president would deal with their desire for obviously having an equal say to the United States within such a board. If they agree to join in a subordinate position to the leadership of Donald Trump, that would send its own signals of weakness and subordination, which would be hard to understand Xi Jinping joining any of these meetings at this board in a sort of subordinate position. So these leaders are themselves obviously considering what this would mean, whether they need to have a seat at the table, whether they don't, whether this organization can only be sustained for as long as Donald Trump is president or not. I mean, there's all sorts of institutional questions as well. So, for instance, if Donald Trump launches this international organization and intends it to be a competitor or even a replacement for other international organizations, is there going to be a treaty that is ratified by the Senate in the United States? Does Donald Trump even have the votes in the Senate to ratify such a treaty for the creation and legitimation and continuation of the United States participation in this sort of treaty? Or is this going to be a sort of rogue international organization after the president steps down at the end of his term? There's not a lot of clarity.
So in your view, could this board undermine existing multilateral institutions like NATO or the EU's diplomatic efforts?
If the president achieves his goals, yes, I mean, that's another one of the concerns, right? It's not just about bringing a new player. It's bringing a new player that is trying to do the same things that these organizations have well-established frameworks to work with. It's a competitor in many ways, and it's going to have its own agenda that might compete with the goals and the agenda of international organizations like NATO and like the United Nations. So, under what authority, for instance, will this new organization intervene in conflicts around the world? Again, we don't know. It's really opaque. There's not a lot of transparency about what the mechanisms will be, what the rules would be, what international law will be followed, if any, and what sort of cooperation would happen with organizations like NATO or organizations like the United Nations, but NATO in particular, since a lot of the European allies who are founding members of NATO are not signing on to this organization.
Daniela Melo, thank you very much for talking to A News. We truly appreciate your insights and expertise on a topic that could reshape global diplomacy in profound ways. Thanks a lot.
Indeed. Thank you.
Now, after the break, we'll take a look at the major stories from the region. Welcome back to A News. Now let's take a closer look at the key stories shaping the region. Syria's government has accused Kurdish-led forces SDF of violating a newly agreed 4-day ceasefire by carrying out attacks that killed government soldiers in the northeast. The SDF denies responsibility, saying the deaths were caused by explosions during Syrian military operations.
A fragile 4-day ceasefire announced on Tuesday in the northeast of Syria is under threat after Damascus accused the Kurdish-led Syrian Democratic Forces of violating it. The Syrian government says SDF attacks killed 11 soldiers and wounded dozens more, including in what it described as a drone strike on troops securing a captured military base. The SDF denies any drone attack, blaming at least one deadly blast on explosives being moved by Syrian forces. The fighting comes as Damascus presses the SDF to agree to a plan for integration into the central state. Syrian troops have continued advancing in parts of Hasaka province, while the SDF retains control of Hasaka city and the Kurdish-majority city of Qamishli. Damascus says it will not enter those cities during the ceasefire. Security concerns have risen at detention sites linked to the Islamic State. Around 200 low-level IS fighters escaped from Shadadi prison earlier this week after SDF guards withdrew, though Syrian forces say many have since been recaptured. US officials add that hundreds of other foreign IS fighters were transferred before the escape and remain in custody. Government forces have also moved into the Al-Hol camp near the Iraqi border, which houses thousands of people linked to IS after the SDF withdrew from the area.
The United States has begun relocating 150 Islamic State detainees from Syria to Iraq in cooperation with Baghdad. Washington expressed gratitude to Iraq for facilitating the transfer, part of broader efforts to manage US IS detainees amid shifting front lines. Up to 7,000 prisoners are expected to be moved. It's after Syrian government troops advanced into northeastern regions over the weekend, reclaiming territory and forcing the SDF fighters to withdraw. China and Central Asia are reporting record figures in mutual trade. The latest data show turnover has surpassed $100 billion, with steady growth over recent years. Our correspondent Fariza Kalimurzuna has more.
Trade turnover between China and the 5 Central Asian countries exceeded $100 billion in 2025, reaching a historical high. This was announced by a spokesperson for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of China. According to the spokesperson, mutual trade has been growing for the 5th consecutive year. Last year, China became the largest trading partner of the Central Asian countries for the first time, surpassing other external markets in the region. Officials in Beijing note that not only the volume but also the structure of trade is changing. An increasing range of goods from Central Asia is entering the Chinese market, including products from the chemical industry, metallurgy and the agro-industrial sector. And according to official data, the combined volume of exports and imports between the two sides rose by 12% year on year. At the same time, the trade balance remains positive in China's favor. Against the backdrop of global economic instability and the slowdown in world trade, Chinese officials say trade with Central Asia continues to expand, pointing to the China Central Asia mechanism as the framework underpinning this growth. Fariza Kalimurzina, Almaty, A News.
President of Azerbaijan Ilham Aliyev held talks with U.S. President Donald Trump in Davos on Thursday. The two leaders discussed the development of Azerbaijan-U.S. relations following President Donald Trump's return to office. They also exchanged views on regional issues, including steps toward normalizing relations between Azerbaijan and Armenia and broader connectivity projects in the South Caucasus. Azerbaijan and the United States have advanced talks on a strategic partnership charter, with a second working group meeting held online on the high-level leadership. Discussions focused on energy, trade, security and digital cooperation. Meanwhile, a first-ever bilateral U.S. business mission to Baku is scheduled for the 9th and 10th of February to strengthen economic ties.
Azerbaijan and the United States have been working to finalize the text for the Strategic Partnership Charter between both countries. This follows the Memorandum of Understanding that was signed at the Washington Peace Summit last August. They held their second meeting of the Strategic Working Group online. It was chaired by Azerbaijan's Deputy Foreign Minister Elnur Mammadov and the U.S. Deputy Assistant Secretary of State Sonata Kolta. Participants discussed cooperation in areas such as energy, trade, transit, as well as regional connectivity and investment. Also topics on defense and security, counter-terrorism, artificial intelligence, and digital infrastructure were talked about. Meanwhile, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, together with the U.S. Department of State, is organizing the first bilateral business mission to Azerbaijan next month. During the two-day visit on the 9th and 10th of February in Baku, a high-level delegation will give U.S. companies the opportunity to meet directly with Azerbaijani government bodies, state-owned companies and leading private sector firms. They'll be focusing on energy, digital transformation, defense, transport, as well as agriculture, healthcare, finance and investment. The program includes meetings with the presidential administration, the Cabinet of Ministers, relevant ministries, as well as with SOCAR, the State Oil Fund of Azerbaijan, Azepromo, Pasha Holding, and the Azerbaijan-US Chamber of Commerce.
Azerbaijan's SOCAR is acquiring a 10% stake in the Baleina oil and gas project off the coast of Côte d'Ivoire. The deal with Italy's Eni was signed in Davos during the World Economic Forum by SOCAR President Roshan Najab and Eni CEO Claudio Descalzi. Baleina, one of the West Africa's largest offshore discoveries, began production in 2023 and is set to expand significantly in its next development phase. The European Union has formally launched a process to suspend visa-free travel for Georgian diplomats and officials. EU leaders warn that if Georgia fails to align with core diplomatic principles, the visa-free regime enjoyed by all Georgian citizens could also be at risk. Our correspondent Nini Nikolashvili has more from Tbilisi.
At a briefing on January 21st, European Commission spokesperson Markus Lammert confirmed that the EU has activated a revised visa suspension mechanism targeting holders of Georgian diplomatic, service and official passports. The European Commission has already sent its assessment to the European Parliament and the Council, starting a process that, once approved, will make the suspension mandatory and uniform across all EU member states. EU officials say the decision follows years of growing concern, which intensified after disputed parliamentary elections in 2024, continued mass protests, pressure on journalists, and what Brussels describes as democratic backsliding in Georgia. Although the EU partially suspended visa facilitation for Georgian diplomats last January, not all member states implemented the decision. As a result, the EU updated its legal framework at the end of 2025, making the mechanism faster, clearer, and easier to enforce. The new system focuses on passport categories rather than individual officials. Brussels stresses that this is only the first step. European officials openly warn that if the current course continues, visa-free travel could be restricted for all ordinary Georgian citizens as well. A December European Commission report stated that Georgia could ultimately lose visa-free travel entirely and be moved to the EU's visa-required country list. The response from the ruling Georgian Dream has been openly confrontational. Parliamentary Speaker Shalwa Papashvili dismissed the move as bureaucratic blackmail, saying that officials are not afraid of visas and will not trade what he called patriotism for pressure from Brussels, signaling a firm refusal to change the course. Nini Nikolaishvili, Tbilisi, A-News.
The Iranian people are still left without access to global internet on Wednesday, although most of the domestic connections are available. It's after weeks of protests have subsided that saw thousands being killed.
Iran remains largely cut off from the global internet. Around 90 million people in the country remain without communication to the outside world, according to data from NetBlocks. While most domestic internet services are now working, access to the global web is still restricted for ordinary Iranians. The government says it started restoring internet connections for some offices and companies involved in international business. However, personal mobile phones, home networks, and foreign media offices remain offline. Internet restriction was the government's decision during the recent unrest. Nationwide protests broke out in late December after the national currency, the rial, lost value and prices rose sharply. The unrest has now subsided. Currently, and the country's military and intelligence agencies say they're working to arrest terrorist groups. Iranian state television has released the first official death toll from the recent anti-government demonstrations, reporting that more than 3,117 people were killed during the crackdown. Meanwhile, Iranian media warn that the prolonged internet blackout could seriously damage the country's digital economy. One online retail company reports sales have fallen by as much as 80 to 90%, raising concerns that continued disruptions could trigger a broader economic downturn in the coming months.
Now we'll take a short break. Right after the break, we'll discuss the U.S. transfer of Islamic State detainees from Syria to Iraq and its impact on regional security. See you shortly. Welcome back to A-News. The United States has begun transferring hundreds of Islamic State detainees from northeastern Syria to Iraq amid a rapidly shifting security landscape following new ceasefire arrangements between Damascus and Kurdish-led forces. The move comes as Syria's government reasserts control over areas long run autonomously, raising urgent questions about stability, counterterrorism, and the future of the Kurdish partnership with Washington. To discuss the implications of these developments, I'm joined now by Hamdi Rifai, Government Relations Executive Director at MOS Strategies and a Foreign Affairs Analyst, joining us from Washington, D.C. Hamdi, welcome to the program.
Thank you for having me on. Always a pleasure to see you.
Thanks. Hamdi, why is the U.S. moving IS detainees now, and what risks was Washington trying to avoid by acting quickly? And how significant is the reported plan to move up to 7,000 Islamic State detainees to Iraq for regional security?
Well, there's several things going on here. Primary amongst them is that there is a risk that in the transfer of these detention facilities from the SDF, YPG, PKK to the official legitimate Syrian government authorities, there could be issues. And we've seen that already happened. In a desperate attempt of the Kurdish militants to show their importance, they opened one of the prisons in Hasaka where prisoners did escape. And as we also know, there was for 10 years now, the SDF has tried to prove in its relevance by claiming that it and only it can hold the prisoners. The problem with that has been, of course, that they have not only held ISIS prisoners, any political opponent has been labeled ISIS. And so it's imperative for the United States to now review each and every one of these prisoners' histories and see who is actually ISIS, who are the children that could be released, who are the ones that were just simply political opponents. And in a chaotic environment where there's an ever-shifting landscape of security issues, it's important for the U.S. to have some stability. So moving them to Iraq makes a lot of sense. And certainly, while the new Syrian government has proven its effectiveness in dealing with security issues, providing information to the U.S. government, and working jointly on kinetic projects to combat ISIS, it nonetheless will be much easier and quieter to do that in Iraq.
Hamdi, how does Syria's reassertion of control in Raqqa and Deir ez-Zor change the counter-IS equation on the ground?
These areas were always predominantly Arab. By having a terror group like the SDF in control there, it was a virtual guarantee that ISIS would never be completely eliminated, because the SDF needed ISIS to exist in order to continue its relevance to the United States. But Tom Barak has been completely transparent about it and said, the SDF, YPG, PKK terror group's time has come. It's expired. It is no longer relevant for security concerns related to ISIS. After 10 years, it's proven that it will never defeat ISIS. And so by these areas coming back under the control of the Syrian government, now we finally see that there will be a door open to the final and complete defeat of ISIS and to bringing stability back to Syria.
Do the renewed clashes and drone attack allegations suggest the ceasefire is already unraveling?
I don't think the ceasefire ever really took effect because the Kurds have never, well, when I say the Kurds, I mean the SDF, YPG, PKK Kurds that are often referred to as the Kurds in the general media amongst journalists and political figures. The YPG, PKK has never been able to really effectively engage in any kind of diplomatic agreement or keep its terms in any case. As with the March 10th agreement, they fulfilled nothing to move forward in that agreement. And the Syrian government gave them a full year to engage in positive or constructive acts. So when we talk about the ceasefire really never had a chance because they were undermining it while they were signing the ceasefire. So the ceasefire is important, but more importantly is how the Syrian government addresses the remaining areas. We saw that the Syrian government took control already of approximately 75% of the areas controlled by the SDF in a matter of just a week. The Syrian government could, within one day, take control of Shobani, Hasaka, Kamishli. However, those areas have a larger Kurdish population. So the Syrian government is trying to give them a chance to actually engage in a constructive way. While that is happening, unfortunately, we're seeing that instead of embracing the ceasefire, they are bringing foreign fighters, Kurdish foreign fighters from Iran, from Turkey that are actual PKK. They're bringing foreign fighters, Kurdish fighters from Iraq, who are flooding into these areas to engage in violence. So there is no real hope that the ceasefire can take effect.
Hamdi, in your view, is Damascus seeking full integration of the SDF, or is it more about disarming and sidelining it?
I think the time for the SDF to integrate has expired. They've exhausted every opportunity that's been given them. So the idea that they could be integrated now is really not possible. The Syrian government entertained the possibility that they could retain their own military command to some extent in the past. Now, what is happening is individual SDF fighters are being allowed to integrate through a process. So they're being reviewed individually. And of course, we saw that most of those fighters already that have defected from the SDF and joined the government were Arab ethnicity fighters. And yet we are still seeing many Kurdish fighters who are defecting from the SDF, YPG, PKK, joining the government. But that possibility of them being an individual fighting force or remaining with any kind of command structure is gone. They abused those opportunities. They failed to act. They did not move forward.
How is Turkey viewing these developments, particularly around Kobani and the border areas?
This is certainly a good development for Turkey because the YPG was simply a bomb waiting to go off for Turkey. While the PKK technically said that they were disarming in Turkey, what's happened here is that they really just shifted to Syria. So these foreign fighters from Turkey who aren't Syrian came to Syria, continued to be armed, joined the YPG, and as we saw, utilized tunnels and created a whole structure of arms trafficking and drug trafficking, and utilized the resources and oil of Syria to just build further violence against the state of Turkey. Now the state of Turkey has an opportunity where it can finally close that PKK door on this issue by dealing with the problem in Syria.
Hamdi Rifai, thank you very much for your insights and for joining us. We truly appreciate your time and expertise. Thanks a lot.
God bless you and all of Azerbaijan. I wish you all the best.
Thanks. That's all we have for now. Thank you for joining us and stay tuned to A News for more.